So our talk tonight is on the Sacrament of Matrimony. Matrimony in the family stands at the center of human society as the first natural society created by God at the beginning, at the moment of creation, as we could say, the first and vital cell of all society. And the prototype of every social order. Right? So every kind of society looks to matrimony as its kind of model. And we could say one of the great missions of the church today is defending the sacrament of matrimony and the family in the face of all kinds of attacks that increasingly are threatening it. Everyone comes into being in the cradle of a family of some kind. And thus it's the primary place in which we become human and become more human. Back in 50 years ago at the Second Vatican Council, the Council in its document Gaudium et Spes speaks about the grave attacks on the family. So it says, the well-being of the individual person and human society is intimately linked with the healthy condition of that community produced by marriage and the family. And yet the excellence of this institution is not everywhere reflected with equal brilliance, since polygamy, the plague of divorce, so-called free love, and other disfigurements have an obscuring effect. Right? So these would be the attacks on the family. In addition, the document says, married love is too often profaned by excessive self-love, the worship of pleasure, illicit practices against human generation. And that's a reference there to contraception. Moreover, serious disturbances are caused in families by modern economic conditions and the demands of civil society, which doesn't always help the family but often works against it. John Paul II has a great document on the family, marriage and the family, called Familiaris Consortio, that he wrote in 1981. It was after a synod of bishops called to study the family and what the church can do to defend it, marriage and the family. And John Paul II, as in so many of his writings, he begins by looking at the signs of the times and looking at, well, what's positive in the world with regard to marriage and the family and what's negative. And so there are some positive things. He says, for example, there's a more lively awareness of personal freedom. So it used to be centuries ago that most marriages perhaps were arranged. And so there wasn't that sense of freely entering into it and seeking the unit of good. So he says there's a more lively awareness of personal freedom and greater attention to the quality of interpersonal relations in marriage. So that would be something positive. And promoting the dignity of women. So feminism rightly understood, responsible procreation, and the education of children. But the negative aspects are more visible, and we could say far more visible. And that would be, he says, a mistaken concept of the independence of the spouses. Because if each spouse is seeking self-fulfillment, that will go against the unity simply of the marriage. So a kind of sense of personal autonomy, serious misconceptions regarding the relationship of authority between parents and children, the idea that children should decide what they want to receive from their parents, concrete difficulties the family experiences in transmission of values, how to, basically the idea that it's not our mission to transmit values to the children, but they'll choose themselves. The growing number of divorces, the scourge of abortion, ever more frequent recourse to sterilization, and the appearance of a truly contraceptive mentality. These are the challenges, and they're all linked together in what could be seen as a false notion of freedom. That's one of the main themes of John Paul II in many different writings, that modernity has a notion of freedom that's essentially negative. nobody's going to tell me what to do. In other words, freedom simply as freedom from, all too often, responsibility. Freedom from the law. Freedom from even the law of God. So he says, and therefore freedom from commitment. He says, at the root of these negative phenomena, there frequently lies a corruption of the idea and the experience of freedom, conceived not as a capacity for realizing the truth of God's plan for marriage and the family. That would be the positive sense of freedom. Freedom for. And so freedom is fundamentally, first and foremost, freedom for. It's the freedom to do God's plan in a personal way. That's the idea of freedom. And in order to do that, I have to be free from obstacles to that. So freedom has both a for and a from. But modern culture puts the from first. So he says, we conceive it as an autonomous power of self-affirmation, often against others for one's own selfish well-being. Let's look now at, so these are kind of the contemporary perspective. Let's look at the nature of marriage. Now, but before I look at the nature of marriage, why is there such a thing as marriage? And to get at this, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. In order to understand all the sacraments, when we started with the sacraments back at the beginning of this series, we saw that God instituted sacraments because of man's nature, being a rational animal and knowing things first by senses, and then from the senses grasping universal and spiritual truths. And so it's man's nature to come to the spiritual through the sensible. And even before that, God gives us sacraments that involve both a sensible and a spiritual dimension on the image of human nature, which is both sensible and spiritual, and those two aspects united. So man's a substantial union of body and soul, of the sensible and physical and spiritual, and we come to the spiritual through the sensible. Right? That's man's nature. And so we saw in all the sacraments, God gives us grace through sensible means because that's fitting human nature. We come to the spiritual through the sensible, even in the supernatural order. And that's true, very much so, with regard to marriage. One of the main themes of John Paul II's theology of the body is that God's plan is to make his invisible love manifested through the mirror of human love, and precisely through spousal love. And so he's created marriage at the beginning to be something that represents the divine love. But in order for human love to represent the divine love, human love has to be in accordance with the divine plan. And that plan is that there's a double symbolism. The divine love is manifested in human spiritual love, the spiritual love of the spouses, by which they completely give themselves to each other spiritually over the course of their marriage. But that spiritual love is manifested also physically in the act proper to the spouses, the conjugal act. So there's a double symbolism. The conjugal act represents conjugal love, and that represents the divine love. In other words, conjugal love, the love of the spouses for each other, in a spiritual way, is the human imitation of the divine love, and the conjugal act is the physical manifestation of that spiritual love. And therefore, in order for this symbolism to work, conjugal love has to have certain properties by which it will represent the divine love, and likewise the conjugal act will have to have those same properties. Otherwise, it won't represent but it will do the opposite, hide or de-manifest, what should we say, simply hide the divine love. And so the key idea is that since this is a sacred reality, divine love, human spousal love and the conjugal act have a sacred quality as being privileged means of representing the divine love. All right, hopefully this will become more clear as we go on. Now, in order to understand marriage, we have to look at Genesis 1 and 2, and especially Genesis 2. And so this is what John Paul II did in his Wednesday catechesis that we call the theology of the body. And this was a cycle of Wednesday talks that he gave for, I forget exactly how many years, but something like 5 years. And they form a unity. They start with Genesis, with Scripture on marriage. It starts with Jesus' response when he was questioned about divorce, and Jesus in his response said, well, it was not so in the beginning. So Jesus refers back to Genesis 2, the institution of marriage. And so he dwells on that for about a year. And the ending of the theology of the body is where, what we'll look at later, an explanation of why contraception is contrary to God's plan. So he, in order to get there, why contraception is disordered, first you have to look at, well, what is marriage and what are its properties based on the very creation of man. In other words, you have to lay down a foundation to understand the church's teaching on contraception. So that's what John Paul II does in the theology of the body. And at the beginning, when he looks at Genesis 2, he spends several Wednesdays speaking about Adam's experience of solitude before Eve was created. And we might ask, well, why did God do it that way? Because it seems kind of odd. He made Adam first, and Adam, it was not good for Adam to be alone. And what does God do then? He doesn't immediately make Eve. He makes cows and horses and rabbits and brings them to Adam, and Adam names them and doesn't find a companion fit for himself. And so precisely in naming the animals and seeing his difference from them and recognizing that they're not spiritual, he comes to recognize his own solitude. And that's a good thing, actually. I mean, the solitude is a bad thing. But the recognizing one's solitude without his spouse is a good thing, because it shows it's a recognition of what he's for, that he's for giving himself to another. And if he doesn't find that other, he experiences a fundamental lack of fulfillment. So at last, when Eve is created, Adam says, or exults, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Now we might wonder, well, Adam at the beginning had God, because Genesis tells us that, at least we see after the sin, Adam hid at the time in which he would walk with God in the cool of the evening. And that's a kind of metaphor, that walking with God in the cool of the evening, for a friendship with God. And this is why the Catholic doctrine teaches that Adam and Eve were created in a state of grace, because we can't have friendship with God without grace. So we can see that Adam and Eve were in grace. They had this friendship with God, and therefore even before Eve was created, Adam was in friendship with God. So we might wonder, well, if he had God as friend, why was it not good for him to be alone? Because he wasn't totally alone. And I think we can answer this using that principle we gave before. It's man's nature that we come to understand spiritual things through sensible things. And so it's proper for man to come to understand the divine love only through experiencing first human love. And Adam, before the creation of Eve, didn't experience that. And so he didn't have analogies to understand the divine love without understanding first human self-giving. Because we naturally understand the divine self-giving on the analogy of marriage. and of human self-giving and human marriage and parenthood. And so, in order to understand God in a human way, Adam needed the experience of experiencing spousal love first. And this is why marriage, right from the beginning, we could say was the primordial sacrament. Sacrament in the sense of a sacred sign representing something bigger than itself. So right from the beginning, human marriage, that self-giving between Adam and Eve, was understood as a sign of God's total self-giving to man. And not only was it a sacred sign of that giving, but marriage in Eden would also have been a transmitting of grace. Because in Eden, before the fall, in the garden, the marital act would have transmitted not only human nature, as it does today, but also grace, because children born in Eden would have been conceived in grace, just as Adam and Eve were created in grace. But since that original state was lost, marriage no longer transmits grace in that way that it would have in Eden. But it still remains always a sacred sign of the divine love. And so Adam's exulting when Eve was created would have been him understanding that he was for another, and therefore he was made for giving himself as a gift to Eve and vice versa. And so that original unity in which Adam exulted would have been the experience of a mutual self-giving that was complementary. Adam to Eve and Eve to Adam. And thus, John Paul II speaks of this union as carrying within it a particular awareness of the meaning of the body in the reciprocal self-gift of persons. In other words, that this gift that they were to make to one another involves both the spirit and the body, and precisely in that unity. And therefore, conjugal love and the conjugal act as the expression of conjugal love. Now, when Jesus was asked about marriage, we said he refers back to the beginning. In the beginning, it was not so with regard to divorce. Have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female? For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one. And in that becoming one, we can connect it with Genesis 1, verses 27 and 28, where God gives his first commandment to them. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And that would be the primordial commandment, to be fruitful. And so from these texts, Genesis 2 and Genesis 1, we can see the fundamental properties of marriage as it will exist through all the ages. And so what are these properties? Well, we see that it's an exclusive union. Adam gives himself fully to Eve and Eve to Adam, and there aren't third parties. And we see that they're complementary. Adam and Eve are of opposite genders, and thus there's a complementary union between them. The union is indissoluble, and so that's why Jesus says, in the beginning it was not so, and what God has joined together, let not man set asunder. And that union is formed by a personal act of self-giving. And we could say a personal act of free consent to giving oneself in that way that can't be taken back. And so it has to be marriage is created it's created by God when He makes human nature, but each individual marital bond is created by the spouse's consent, consenting to give themselves in that total way. And that consent involves a self-gift that's total, involving mutual service to one another and involving an openness to life, and therefore the mission, at least potentially, of procreation and education. Right, so those are the fundamental properties that we see in Genesis 1 and 2. And we could synthesize all those properties in one idea: total gift of self. Now, we give of ourselves not just in marriage, but also in friendship, in religious life, and many other kinds of societies than just marriage. But what's proper to marriage is that it involves a total gift. And it's that totality that gives to marriage those properties that can't be taken away from it. And it's precisely because of the totality that it mirrors the divine love, which is total. Right? So God's infinite love is mirrored most on earth by a love that is similarly total, and therefore spousal. And that means if it's total, that it can't be taken back, right? Because if it's total, I don't retain what I've totally given, and therefore I can't retract, because that would have made it only a partial gift, only a temporary gift. And likewise, it has to be exclusive, because I can't give myself totally to 20 individuals or even 2. And it has to be fruitful, because if I hold back my fruitfulness, say if I hold back paternity or maternity, I'm not giving a total gift, but only a partial gift. And so the totality of the gift means that it has to be ordered to life, because that's part of the totality that's being given, the gift of paternity and maternity. So a couple that, say, plan to, contracept throughout their married life, they obviously wouldn't be giving themselves totally to each other. And the same would be true even in one act. The conjugal act wouldn't be the sign of a total giving if it were deliberately frustrated of its fruitfulness. We'll come back to that. And in order to be fruitful, that conjugal love has to be complementary, because God has blessed complementarity with fruitfulness. And we'll come back to that also. And so all the fundamental properties of marriage come from the fact that marriage has to have these properties in order to be a total gift. And anything less than that, anything different from that, simply wouldn't be a total gift at all. Now, we're capable of this, a total gift, because we're made in the image and likeness of God. And that's what distinguishes us from other creatures who aren't in the image of likeness, who can't make a gift of themselves. A horse can't make a gift of himself at all, because in order to give yourself, you have to possess yourself. In other words, only a free creature can give of himself. And therefore, only man and the angels can give of themselves in that way, because it requires self-dominion, which is a property of being rational. Right? So it's something that only that a man is capable of by being in the image and likeness of God, and it's precisely the way in which we realize, one of the ways in which we realize that image, by mirroring the divine love. Or we could say more in general, a total self-gift is the fullest way by which we mirror that divine love. And a total self-gift can be given in 2 ways. We'll see. Directly to God, that would be religious life, celibacy for the sake of the kingdom, or sacramentally, and that would be marriage, as representing that self-gift totally to God, sensibly, on the natural order, or elevated to the supernatural order by grace. Paul VI has in his encyclical on the immorality of contraception, Humanae Vitae, his most controversial encyclical and very great encyclical, in the course of explaining why contraception is wrong, he speaks about the properties of marriage. And he says that marriage involves the marital love, conjugal love, involves a love which is total. That's the key idea we're saying here. A love that is total is at the bottom of page 4. That very special form of personal friendship in which husband and wife generously share everything, allowing no unreasonable exceptions and not thinking solely of their own convenience. Whoever really loves his partner loves not only for what he receives, but loves that partner for the partner's own sake, content to be able to enrich the other with the gift of himself. That's the essence of marriage, is that involves this total self-gift. And we could say that this has 5 properties that we mentioned before. Every marriage has to be fully human. It has to be a human personal act created by the free consent of the spouses. It has to be indissoluble, otherwise it won't be total. It has to be exclusive, otherwise it won't be total. It has to be fruitful, again, otherwise it wouldn't be total. And in order to be fruitful, it has to be complementary between a man and a woman. All right, let's take these in order. Let's start with fully human. So we could say that because man is a personal creature created in the image of God, his procreation, right, the procreation of the human race, has to be accomplished in a personal way. In other words, in a way proper to someone made in the image likeness of God, and thus different from the propagation of, horses or rabbits. Right? So human sexuality will have to be exercised in a way proper to one capable of making a gift of himself. And thus, human sexuality has to involve the harmony between the physical and the spiritual aspect of gift. In other words, the physical self-gift has to be a mirror of the spiritual self-gift. So we could say that sexuality in human persons can never be separated from the personal and spiritual dimension. And sexual sins will be precisely attempts to make that separation. And man, we see in Genesis 2 that man from the beginning is a spousal creature. In other words, Adam was ordered to that gift to Eve and encountered frustration until Eve was created. And Eve likewise was ordered to a gift to Adam. And that's written into our nature, and it remains in our nature even if we are called to a different state in life. And so, likewise, the religious remains a spousal creature. And that's very important for understanding their own religious life, because religious life will involve a spousal gift, but made to Christ and to God. And so every man is a spousal creature in that sense. Now, we said that in order to be total, the gift has to be irrevocable. We see that again, both in marriage and in religious life. That's the beauty of a permanent vow, by which you give yourself totally, and it can't be retracted. And the same is true in marriage. So if it's not indissoluble, marriage would never be total. Right? So wanting to have a marital union that's dissoluble simply is not wanting to get married. Right? Because the very nature of wanting to make a total gift is wanting to make it in such a way that you can't retract it. And so really, admitting the possibility of divorce is not admitting the possibility of total self-gift. Right? And this is why the church defends the indissolubility of marriage despite so many objections, so many pressures in the world to redefine marriage so as to conceive it as potentially dissoluble. But that would be to deny the very existence of a total gift. For better or worse. Right? The beauty of the marital gift is precisely those words, I do for better or worse. Right? In other words, that's what makes the gift have such a beauty. Because you're giving, even though potentially it might include, that gift might include great sacrifice and hardship, potentially. And that makes the value of the gift so beautiful in the eyes of God and even in the eyes of your spouse. Yeah. And the same thing is true of the exclusivity. Right? So again, polygamy, by its very nature, is contrary to the nature of a total self-gift. So John Paul II has a beautiful section in Familiaris Consortia where he defends the indissolubility of marriage. And he says that the only place in which this self-giving in its whole truth is made possible is marriage. It's the only way you can really give a total gift of yourself is in marriage, understood in the way that we've said, indissoluble, exclusive, and order to fruitfulness. The institution of marriage is not an undue interference by society or authority, nor the imposition of a form. It's the interior requirement of the covenant of conjugal love. In other words, conjugal love requires that it be indissoluble, exclusive, and fruitful. Right? That's the only way it's going to be properly conjugal love. By conjugal, we mean total. And therefore, the conjugal act will have to have the same properties. And thus, to it, only given to one. And only realized within the context of that conjugal love, which involves a commitment for life. Right? The only place in which that self-giving is really true. And therefore, it's not something, if we said that freedom is fundamentally freedom for the good, these requirements of marriage, that it be indissoluble, that it be exclusive, that it be complementary and open to life, are not impositions on our will, but actually requirements that enable our will to reach its target. In other words, they're conditions that enable us to realize what we have written into us by being spousal creatures. They're what enable us not to be frustrated irrevocably. Now, so this is written into man's nature at creation. History shows us that marriage, understood in this way, the reality of history very often deviates from what marriage is and is meant to be, and right from the beginning. In fact, Genesis 4 gives us the first mention of polygamy, and it's Lamech, the great grandson of Cain, is said to be the first polygamist. But despite its antiquity, despite its geographical spread, it's radically contrary to the very notion of a total self-gift. And therefore, it's always and everywhere contrary to the requirements, we could say, of spousal love understood as total self-gift. John Paul II says, such a communion is radically contradicted by polygamy. This, in fact, directly negates the plan of God, which was revealed from the beginning, because it is contrary to the equal personal dignity of men and women who in matrimony give themselves with a love that is total and therefore unique and exclusive. And it's obvious that polygamy fosters jealousy, and we see that in Scripture, for example, in Sarah and Hagar. And every other instance that we encounter polygamy, biblically, we see the terrible consequences that often last generations and generations afterwards. Now, this may not yet be a pressing issue in our country, but down the road, there's no doubt that it will be, because of the influence of Islam and desires to have a Sharia law observed and so in many parts of the world, this is a huge problem. All right. Now, obviously, the same thing, though, is true with regard... so, polygamy attacks the exclusivity, divorce attacks the indissolubility, and that's a plague in our society directly. Let's look at the property of openness to life, fecundity. Now, the church teaches that marriage has two fundamental ends: procreation and union. And it's God's will that those two be inseparably tied together. So we speak of the unitive and the procreative ends of marriage. And just as, in a way similar to what Jesus says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Well, we could say the same thing here. God has joined together these two ends, the unitive and the procreative. Let not man try to rend them asunder, to separate them. And this is the fundamental teaching of Humanae Vitae. And before that, Gaudium et Spes, Second Vatican Council, speaks about, as a mutual gift of two persons, this intimate union and the good of the children impose total fidelity on the spouses and argue for an unbreakable oneness between them. In other words, the mission of paternity, procreation, and the mission of education of children requires that the parents have a union. In other words, openness to life involves a mission that involves not just that one moment, but a whole life. Because a human person comes into the world immensely needy. And needy not just materially, but above all emotionally and spiritually. Right? So the human person needs a home in which to learn to be human, and that home needs to actually be there not just for a short time, but throughout their life insofar as is possible. And so you can see that union and procreation go together, because in order to fulfill the mission of openness to life, there needs to be a profound union between the spouses. And that union has to be complementary. In other words, the union, first in generation and then in education, has to involve the union of two complementary aspects, the gift of maternity and the gift of paternity. And the children, in order to come to the world, need both of those gifts, and in order to suitably grow, they need the combination of those two gifts. And so procreation involves a mission that lasts basically for life, at least potentially. And so children can only be properly reared and educated in a stable home in which they learn love from the love of their parents. Now, obviously, that's not to say if a child loses a parent, he can't learn love, but he'll learn it probably from other couples. In other words, spousal love is the principal way by which we learn really the divine love. And anyway, so that union, the key point here is that the unitive end and the procreative end are inseparably bound together. That in order to procreate, you need a union of two, and in order to suitably educate, you need that union of two for life. And then, the very mission of paternity and maternity requires this joint cooperation that binds the spouses together. Now, again, that's not to say that a couple who couldn't have children can't be bound together, but they'll be bound together probably by realizing some form of spiritual maternity-paternity. In other words, just as man is by nature a spousal creature, even if you don't get married, likewise, man by nature has a maternal or paternal mission, even if you don't get married. And in fact, someone who embraces celibacy for the sake of the kingdom can have an augmented spiritual maternity-paternity. Precisely by renouncing the physical, one doesn't renounce the spiritual, but can have it more intensely. So this union is ordered to fruitfulness. And so the couple, and these are the words here of John Paul II, the couple, while giving themselves to one another, give not just themselves, but also the reality of children. And so the potential child is the fruit of that mutual self-gift. And that mirrors the divine love, because the divine love, in totally pouring itself out in the world, is supremely fruitful, creating the world. In other words, the divine love, by its very nature, is fruitful. Everything that exists is the fruit of the divine love. And so it's fitting that human love be given a share in that fruitfulness. And again, physically or spiritually. Now, in Paul VI, when he wrote on contraception, in Humanae Vitae, he states the Church's teaching with regard to contraception using these categories of unitive and procreative end. And so he says, the Church's teaching on contraception is based on the inseparable connection established by God, which man in his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent in the marriage act. I'm on page 7, halfway down. So he's saying that the conjugal act can't separate, by man's own deliberate intention, the unitive and the procreative dimensions or significance of it. And the key here is obviously, many people have a great difficulty understanding this, right? Surveys show us that perhaps 90% of Catholics don't follow this teaching. But it's not a small matter, because this lies at the heart of understanding marriage, self-gift, and even having a society that continues into future generations. For example, in Europe, because of contraception and abortion, that society is actually dying out. And within some generations, will perhaps no longer exist in the way that we know it. No one part of the Bible, of the gospel, can be eliminated without consequences. And so here too, this precept about contraception can't be disregarded without profound consequences for all of society. And you may not see it right away, but future generations will see it. Or will not see it because they won't exist. Anyway, the key to understanding this teaching on contraception and on marriage is really that the conjugal act is a sacred act. And the reason why it's a sacred act is because it's meant to be the reflection of the divine love, and it's the way by which a new human person comes into being, and every human person is a sacred reality made in the image and likeness of God. And in fact, it's a way in which on the natural order we participate with God in the most intense way possible, in a way that even the angels can't participate. Now that's odd. Angels have a higher nature than human beings. But precisely because of their higher nature, being pure spirits, angels can't cooperate in the creation of another angel. And that's because an angel, being a pure spirit, can only be made out of nothing. And only God can make a being out of nothing. So just as our soul, likewise a spiritual reality, God has to make it out of nothing. But our bodies, being a physical reality, is made out of other bodies. And that's where our parents come in. Because we're composed of body and soul, the origin of every human being is in some sense dual. Our bodies come from our parents, and our soul is created out of nothing by God. And thus, because we have bodies, we can participate with God in the creation of another human being, supplying the body. God supplies the soul. Forms in substantial union. Whereas the angels, being pure spirits, can't do that. And so that's an awesome thing. Because that... all right, somebody might say, well, rabbits do that. But what do rabbits cooperate in producing? Not a spiritual being. Not someone created in the image and likeness of God, another rabbit. But only human beings can cooperate with God in the creation of another person made in the image and likeness of God with an eternal destiny, capable of friendship with God. Right? So that's an awesome mission. And therefore, that act by which that's done, in other words, that act by which life is potentially transmitted, is clearly a sacred act. And therefore, what do we do with sacred things? We protect them. Right? We protect them precisely by separating them from their sacredness being lost. So, for example, sacred vessels. What do we do with the Eucharist? I mean, we put it in the tabernacle. We don't just leave it around anywhere because it's sacred, and therefore it has to be kept apart from other things. And likewise, the marital act, because it transmits life, has to be separated out. And it's separated precisely by marriage. We said that's the place in which it has its true meaning. That's the only place in which it can be the sensible sign of a total spiritual self-giving. Because that's the only place in which that total spiritual self-giving exists, is within marriage. And so the conjugal act, because it's sacred, has to be only used within marriage. And not only used within marriage, it also, even within marriage, it has to always be open to life so that it can retain that sacredness of potentially transmitting life. All right, it may happen that it's not the fertile period, in which case I can foresee that it won't transmit life. But still, it's by its very nature open to that, and therefore still sacred. But it wouldn't be the same if I deliberately closed it to life by an act on my part using contraception.
It doesn't exist in heaven, right?
No, it doesn't exist in heaven. And the reason for that is because it's a sacrament. Sacraments don't exist in heaven because in heaven, sacraments are veils, right? Sacraments are sacred signs that transmit grace. And they transmit precisely the grace that they signify. Now in heaven, we won't need sacred signs because we won't need signs at all. In heaven, we'll be face to face. And so in heaven, it won't be necessary to come to know the divine love through the veil of something sensible. Now in heaven, conjugal love will still be there because it'll be part of that communion of saints. But the conjugal act will no longer be there.
So there'll be a bond between...
Sure. All the love that we've built up in this world, whether it's conjugal love, whether it's any kind of love of friendship, any kind of love of benevolence, all of that will be the treasure of heaven. That'll be we could say the horizontal aspect of, that'll be the beauty of fraternal love in heaven. And so conjugal love will be a part of that. But it won't be the same as it is here on earth. Because here on earth, that exclusivity that's proper to conjugal love is because we have bodies. God, because somebody might ask, well, a polygamist might ask like this. A polygamist might say, God loves everyone, and He loves everyone with a total love. Why can't I love 20 people with a total love? Well, there's an obvious answer, right? Because I'm not God. And what does that mean? It means we've got bodies. And so it's impossible to give a total bodily self-gift to 20 people because this is the difference between this material and the spiritual. In the material world, when you divide something material among many, what happens? You've got a pie. All right, so suppose I bring a little pie here, and we've got 100 people. Everyone gets a sliver. In spiritual things, it's not that way, right? That's the beauty of spiritual love, is that the more you give it, what happens? The more it grows. And so God's total spiritual love for each one is not diminished by the fact that it's given to 7 billion people. But our human love would very much be diminished if it were given even to 2.
Like the love for your children.
Mm-hmm.
You know, each child you love
Mm-hmm.
completely,
Mm-hmm.
everything that you have, and the love that you have for child A
Mm-hmm.
is the very same love that you have for child
Mm-hmm.
B, and it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't diminish
Mm-hmm.
your love for child A or
Mm-hmm.
your love for child B.
Right. But there are limits to our attention. So if we had, 500 children, we would have real problems in giving sufficient attention to each one. It's the same way if you have too many students. You won't be able to give the same attention to each one. How did I get into this? So we're saying that the conjugal act, has to reflect conjugal love and the divine love, and therefore it does that by being open to life. And if I deliberately close it off to life, it'll no longer be able to reflect that. Gaudium et Spes says that marriage and conjugal love are by their nature ordered towards begetting and educating of children. Children are really the supreme gift of marriage and contribute very substantially to the welfare of their parents. The God who himself said, "It is not good for man to be alone," and who made man from the beginning male and female, wishing to share with man a certain participation in his own creative work, blessed male and female, saying, "Increase and multiply." Hence, while not making the other purposes of marriage of less account, for example, union, the true practice of conjugal love and the whole meaning of the family life which results from it has this aim, that the couple be ready with stout hearts to cooperate with the love of the Creator and Savior. Parents should regard as their proper mission the task of transmitting human life and educating those to whom it has been transmitted, and that thereby they are cooperators with the love of God, their Creator, and interpreters of that love. Oh, right, I'm sorry, how we got into that? It was in heaven. Right, so these properties that we're talking about are proper to earth. And in heaven, we won't need the veils to manifest the divine love. And we won't need also to continue to propagate the human race, because heaven is the end. And so it's in this life that we have the mission to be fruitful and multiply. Okay. Now, in order to carry out this mission of being fruitful and multiply, we said that the spouses need to aid one another, right? So there needs to be a mutual aid of maternal and paternal gifts in, first of all, in conceiving, and then, more importantly, in educating. So the mutual aid of the spouses is a beautiful end of marriage, but it's inseparable from the mission of maternity and paternity, because that's the most important aspect of the mutual aid. But of course, there's another aspect to the mutual aid, and that's marriage involves a mutual aid in sanctifying each other. So if each one of us is called to holiness, we're to realize that holiness in the state of life in which God causes us, and for the majority that's marriage, and therefore the very state of marriage has to be a sanctifying state. And that means that the spouses have the mission not only to sanctify their children, but also to help sanctify one another. And this is done through their self-giving love to one another, and also because marriage involves the necessity of learning sacrificial love. In other words, precisely renouncing one's own will for the good of one's spouse. Okay, now in order to be fruitful, and in order to properly educate the children, the spouses need to be complementary. So let's look at that, because this is becoming increasingly under attack in our society rapidly. Right? So these various, as increasing number of states legalize same-sex marriage. So it's important to be able to explain why marriage can't be that way and can't be redefined to include same-sex unions. And the principle is simple. In order to be potentially fruitful, and in order to be a perfect and total union, marriage has to be between complementary partners. And it's easy to see how that with regard to the fruitfulness. God has made the union of male and female fruitful, and not the union of man and woman and woman. But it's equally true with regard to the mission of education, and that would be the gifts of maternity and paternity. And it's also true with regard to the very notion of union. And this might be hard to grasp at first, because somebody might think, well, two who are alike could more easily unite than two who are different. But the reality is exactly the opposite. Two who are different are those who can much more easily unite. And why is that? Because when two who are different and complementary unite, each one is giving something that the other doesn't have. And therefore the mutual exchange is properly received and needed, in fact. In other words, when the two are complementary, each partner needs something that they don't have and the other one has. And therefore, the union that's built on that is much more indissoluble and much stronger than when two are identical. So just even in human terms, the union of body and soul, that's a profound union, because body and soul are very complementary and very different. But the union of two bodies simply, suppose you got two rocks, that is very fragile, because there's nothing bonding them. Right? A real bond only comes when there's difference, not when there's identity. So, right, even anatomically, that would be the aspect of fruitfulness. But from the point of view of fruitfulness, clearly you need the complementarity. But even simply from the notion of union, you need complementarity. And to properly mirror the divine love, you need complementarity. Why is that? God has... It has to do with our the fact that we're creatures. The divine love and the creature's response to the divine love, those can't be conceived to be identical. In order for human love to mirror the divine love, God loving creation, God loving each one of us, that love of God for the creature, every human person, can't be understood to be an identical love, right? It has to be understood to be a radically complementary, because you have the creative, active love of God who brings us out of nothingness into being, and you have the response of the creature who has to have been loved by God first, and then can receive that and then give himself back. So our love of God can't be understood to be identical with God's, but very much complementary. And complementary with the aspect of giving and, above all, receiving. And so God has written that into human love as well. In other words, he's made human love a kind of mirror of God loving the creature, in the sense that in human generation he's given one gender and a role that's active, and the other gender a role that's receptive. They're both of equal dignity, but they're different, and each one has something different to give. Paternal gifts and maternal gifts. And we could go even higher. This mirrors not only the divine, God-loving creatures, but it also mirrors the love in the Trinity itself. The love in the Trinity is, the love of the Father to the Son and the Son to the Father. The Father and the Son are, yes, they're identical in nature. There's one divine nature, and likewise the Holy Spirit. But in their personal attribute, in their, we could say, personality, they're radically complementary. The Father and the Son. The Father is the Father alone is the font of the divine life. He's the person in the Trinity that's source and that doesn't receive from another person. The Son is he who receives the divine life from the Father, and the Holy Spirit is he who receives that divine life from the love of the Father and Son. And so each person in the Trinity is radically complementary. And it's not so that the love that is the life of God is a love that's radically complementary and not of identicals. I don't know if I succeeded here. In other words, the love of the Trinity isn't between three fathers. That would not be Trinity. Right? That it's only Trinity because there's complementarity. And that's what's beautiful. Now, we don't understand. Nor do I. I'm just mumbling words that I don't even fully grasp. But I know this, that every created complementarity, such that between man and woman, between maternity and paternity, is a mirror of an infinitely richer complementarity that is the life of the Blessed Trinity. And that complementarity is beautiful because it's a mirror of God's complementarity. And so someone wanting to annul that and say, I'm going to seek another who's just like myself, that to form a union with, rather than one who's complementary, that would be actually to hide rather than to manifest the love of the Trinity. Now, what is this complementarity? Let's look at it more closely. And the complementarity between man and woman is, above all, the complementarity between these two missions, the mission of paternity and the mission of maternity. And the best way we can get at this is looking at what does that mission involve? For the woman, that mission involves receiving life in her own body and carrying that life in her own body. And therefore, if God, whenever He gives a mission, gives appropriate gifts for that mission, the woman who has this mission of receiving life in her body and carrying it in her body for 9 months and then nursing after that, etc., the woman needs to be gifted in a way that would be specially suited to that task. And what would that mean? Attention to the personal. Right? So the mother has to be very attentive to that life that's growing within her. And women are. And men are simply biologically less. And I think any married couple can witness to this from their own experience, that women seem to have this kind of, these nerves that even though you might be separated hundreds of miles, seem to know when something bad is happening to their children. Whereas men seem less equipped by nature in that regard. So I'm taking it, there's a beautiful book by St. Edith Stein, one of the patrons of the Association of Hebrew Catholics, great Hebrew Catholic. And after her conversion to Catholicism, but before she became then a Carmelite in the 1930s, before that she gave a series of talks on the role of woman in society. And this is at the beginning of the feminist movement. And she was very concerned that feminism not go off course. And the going off course would be wanting to see work for an equality with man, overlooking gender difference. Whereas feminism, rightly understood, according to St. Stein, and I think exactly right, would be seeing what's proper to woman and realizing that, rather than seeking simply an equality that doesn't recognize difference. And so she has beautiful articles in which she asks, well, what is that proper to a woman? And she says, woman naturally seeks to embrace that which is living, personal, and whole. To cherish, guard, protect, nourish, and advance growth is her natural maternal yearning. And that's because she has this mission of carrying life in her body. And so that remains true even of those who embrace the celibate state. They'll still have all of those maternal gifts, which can be used then in spiritual maternity. Lifeless matter, she says, the fact, can hold primary interest for her only insofar as it serves the living and the personal, not ordinarily for its own sake. Abstraction in every sense is alien to the feminine nature. Now, she's a philosopher, right? So she, by her very profession, had to abstract. But even among philosophers, women who do philosophy will be interested in different kinds of problems, probably. And I think she gives a good example of this. She wrote her thesis in philosophy on empathy. Well, that's a very maternal gift, empathy. The living and personal to which her care extends is a concrete whole and is protected and encouraged as totality. Her natural line of thought is directed intuitively and emotionally to the concrete. Anyways, beautiful writings. And John Paul II took a lot from her. And he says similar things. He says, women are more feeling and intuitive people and become involved in things in a more sensitive and complete manner. Men, on the contrary, John Paul II says, this comes from spiritual exercises that he gave back in 1962, I think, or 64. In any case, he gave some conferences to all of them, and then some to the women and some to the men. And this one to the men, he says, we are quite ready to take or conquer in terms of enjoyment, profit, gain, success, even in the moral order. Then comes the question of giving. And at this point, we hang back because we're not prepared to give. The element which is so characteristic under other forms in the spiritual portrait of women is barely perceptible in men. In other words, it costs us more to make that total gift. We're not as well. God divides His gifts, and that's a blessing because that creates complementarity. And so he says, in men, John Paul II, the intellect has a certain supremacy over the heart. And then he goes on to reflect, well, this may be why Christ entrusted responsibility for the gospel as idea to them in the priesthood. The gospel is life, and we're all responsible for it. Women have a great role to play in the church. However, the gospel as idea, within any family, the gift, so this complementarity has to do with each one giving something that they've been specially gifted with, that the other one, in other words, the complementarity of gifts we could summarize in head and heart. So yes, man is in some ways specially gifted with certain ability to abstract. And that may simply be because since the man doesn't carry the child in his own body, he's free to provide. And so being free to provide food and shelter, etc., man has to be gifted with a certain fascination for the instrument. And we see this, that men like instruments, cars, and machines, and the technological, and the mathematical, whereas women are more drawn to the personal. Alice von Hildebrand has a great book called The Privilege of Being a Woman. And in this book, she uses this kind of thought example. Imagine a room in which you place in one corner a newborn baby, and the other corner the latest model computer. And you push a man into this room without any preparation. Which corner are they going to gravitate to? And you push a woman into that room. What corner are they going to gravitate to? Right, and so it'll probably be the woman to the baby and the man to the computer. And then, of course, she asks, and which one makes the better choice? One is made in the image and likeness of God, and the other is simply a lifeless machine. Sorry for the men present. But in any case, so there's a certain giftedness with regard, we could say, to the the abstract in man, so in that sense we could associate it with headship, but in the woman with the heart, which obviously is no less important for any society, especially the family. And that's a source of great richness. And so so let's look at homosexuality. So God's plan is that this union that's total involve this complementarity of gender. And therefore, using sexuality divorced from that complementarity of gender within the context of marriage wouldn't fulfill this representation that God wants represented in human love. And for two profound reasons. Because a homosexual sexual act wouldn't be the mirror of a conjugal love that involves this complementary union, nor would it be gifted by nature with fruitfulness, nor would it be able to supply the complementarity that would be needed for the education of children. By the very nature of things. All right, now somebody might make an objection, say, well, suppose the homosexual couple were in fact complementary. And in fact, that's probably what we do seem to notice, that there is a relationship of roles in homosexual couples. But that would simply be the fact that you can't get around nature. In other words, that simply would be revealing the complementarity that's in the divine plan. The Catechism of the Catholic Church has a beautiful section in which it explains the morality of homosexual relations. And it says, well, at first it speaks of the fact. History shows that there is this phenomenon. Its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained, and that's still true today. And then it goes on to say that, basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. Right? And disordered because of what we said earlier. They're contrary to natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. Right? They can't be fruitful, and they do not proceed from a genuine affective and sexual complementarity. Now, the number of people who have this tendency is not negligible. And for most, it constitutes a trial. And so they are to be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, and without discrimination. But it goes on to say homosexual persons are called to chastity. And that's true of all persons who aren't married. And of course, the married are also called to chastity, but in the form proper to the married state, and that would be that all of their conjugal acts be open to life and not be deliberately closed to it. Now, someone might say, or think, and probably more than someone, many people might think that this image that we presented of marriage is simply impossible after the fall. Right? In Eden, okay, sure, they were created in grace, and they had a gift which we call integrity in Eden. They were naked and not ashamed. In other words, in Eden, they weren't attacked by concupiscence in the way that we are after the fall. Perhaps this image of marriage that we've been painting is simply idealistic. And of course, that's true, it is. It would be impossible without the aid of grace. But God, right from the beginning, right after they were expelled from Eden, offered grace to mankind. Right? So there's no doubt that after the fall, marriage is fragile and subject to attack. Right? And we see that everywhere we turn today. But that mission of marriage from the beginning remains throughout history. And it remains doable throughout history because of the aid of grace. Now, I'm running out of time here. In the Mosaic, so right from the beginning, marriage remained an institution under natural law. In the Mosaic covenant, it was protected by the commandments, and above all the sixth commandment and the ninth commandment, the commandment against adultery and against coveting one's neighbor's wife, and also by beautiful practices of family purity in Judaism, and the fundamental stress on the mission, the greatness of the mission of fruitfulness. Because that mission in Israel was associated with the Messiah. That the fruitfulness of the people in Israel would lead to the Messiah, because the Messiah was to be a son of Abraham. Now, in the Mosaic law, there were imperfections, and those imperfections were there, and Jesus says, because of the hardness of hearts. But in the new covenant, in which grace is given, and those imperfections were the permission for polygamy and divorce. But, obviously, those things were not God's plan, and the prophets present an image of marriage that is, in fact, indissoluble and monogamous, so that it can mirror God's love for Israel. But when God becomes man, when Christ fulfills all revelation and institutes the sacraments as channels of grace, one of those sacraments is matrimony. So matrimony is now elevated to be both a sign and a sign of grace that gives what it represents. So it's a sign of Christ's love for his church, manifested in his incarnation and passion, by which he pours out his life for his bride. So every marriage after the incarnation of those who are united to Christ by baptism becomes a representation of Christ's love for his church and a realization in the couple of what it represents. In other words, marriage becomes a sacrament of the love of Christ and his church, and in that sacrament it's both sign and transmitter of grace. And we see this. So how do we know this is the case? We see it above all in the letter to the Ephesians chapter 5, the passage that's read at weddings. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies, as Christ does the church. I'm skipping a little bit. And then he goes on to quote Genesis 2:24. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is a profound one. And I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church. So every human marriage is a sign of Christ's love for his church. And it communicates the grace to realize that sign. So we could say there's a double. Human marriage manifests the divine love, but it also works the other way around. Christ's love for his church, manifested in his passion, shows to us what marriage is and entails. So, before the incarnation, human love was a kind of way by which we could discover the properties of the divine love. Now, after the incarnation, looking at Christ's love for his bride, the church, we discover more fully what marriage is and what those who are married, what kind of love they're called to. So we could say that through the incarnation, married love has been caught up into divine love and enriched by Christ's redeeming power. This is from the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes. By virtue of this sacrament, spouses fulfill their conjugal and family obligations, penetrated with the Spirit of Christ, and they perfect their own personalities as well as their mutual sanctification. John Paul II says that in Familiaris Consortio, he says, the Lord Jesus takes up this human need of communion, confirms it, purifies it, and elevates it, leading it to perfection through the sacrament of matrimony. The Holy Spirit, who's poured out, offers Christian couples the gift of a new communion of love. That is the living and real image of that unity which makes the church the mystical body of Christ. And the sacrament of marriage does this by giving sanctifying grace, like all sacraments. So every sacrament gives sanctifying grace, either initially, like baptism, or an increase. But each sacrament also gives what we call sacramental graces to realize the purpose of that sacrament. And so marriage, the sacrament of matrimony, gives to the spouses a whole series of graces that will flow throughout their married life to sanctify marriage, to make of their marriage an image of the divine love, and to make of the transmission of life in their family a manifestation of the divine love. And it's to cooperate with God in the family. But we can block those graces. Right? We can block them by not being in a state of grace. And so these graces that are given through the sacrament of matrimony are graces that we can grow in more and more, or graces that we can block. Pius XI speaks about this in a beautiful way in a great encyclical on marriage called Casti Connubii. And this is on page 16 in italics. It says, by these gifts of the sacramental graces, the spouses are assisted not only in understanding, but in knowing intimately, in adhering to firmly, and willing effectively, successfully putting into practice those things that pertain to the marriage state. In other words, everything that we talked about in this talk. The indissolubility, the exclusivity, the fidelity, the totality of the gift, the openness to life, all of those things. For all of those things, we need the aid of grace and the Holy Spirit. And the sacrament of matrimony is a font of those graces for the spouses throughout their married life. This is why, for man, yes, it would be impossible. But for God, nothing is impossible. In other words, with the aid of grace, this mission can be accomplished. And the same thing is true of any other state of life, like the religious life or the priesthood. But, he says, since it is the law of divine providence that men do not reap the full fruit of the sacraments which they receive, unless they cooperate with grace, the grace of matrimony will remain for the most part an unused talent, hidden in the field, unless the parties exercise these supernatural powers and cultivate and develop the seeds of grace they have received. In other words, the sacramental graces of matrimony require our cooperation. And that means they require, for example, the sacrament of penance, frequent access to penance and the Eucharist. Now, every Christian marriage is a sacramental marriage. It's impossible for those who are baptized and have been inserted into Christ by baptism to have a true marriage that's not sacramental. So every marriage of baptized persons will be sacramental. And if it's not sacramental, neither will it be a valid marriage. And that's why Catholics who get married, quote unquote, civilly without a dispensation, in other words, rejecting the sacramental aspect, are not actually validly married. And so the two have to go together. And that... Mm-hmm.
If a Catholic or a baptized Christian marries somebody who hasn't been baptized, that's not
That would be. So that would be different. So if one of the spouses is baptized and the other is not, that could still be a valid marriage, but not sacramental. But the baptized party would have to get a dispensation from the church to do that, for it to be valid. But with the dispensation, yes, it would be valid, but not sacramental. But if both spouses are baptized, it can only be sacramental.
Non-baptized too.
Two non-baptized, so that would be an example of my wife and I, when we were married, we were both unbaptized. And so that would be a natural law marriage that would be valid. But at the moment of baptism, so we're baptized together, at the moment of baptism, that marriage becomes sacramental because it's inserted now into Christ. And so at the very moment of the baptism of adult spouses who are already married, their marriage becomes sacramental.
But if they're forever non-baptized, non-baptized,
right.
very, very, very good.
For the non-baptized, yes, there can be a natural law marriage, which is still has the aspect of being a sign of the divine love, but it won't be a sacrament in the sense of being a sign that gives the grace that it signifies. That's not to say that God's not going to give graces to couples that are married and not baptized.
No grace at all.
He will, yes, he will, absolutely. But it won't be sacramental grace. In other words, it won't be coming through the sacrament, which in them doesn't exist. I've gone way over. Let's leave it here, and then we'll have questions. Sorry about that.